Hello and welcome to the Corporate Facility Council's final First Wednesday webinar for 2018, the Facility Manager's Keys to Effective Emergency Preparedness, presented by Mayra Portolaton and Stephen Clausen, both with Facility Engineering Associates. I do want to let everyone know they have been muted for audio quality and that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free and type them into the question box and we'll go over them during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. A recording of this webinar is also going to be posted to the CFC website, which is ifmacfc.org. If you want a PDF of the PowerPoint, you may go ahead and download that now on the control panel. Simply go to the section on the control panel that says Handout, expand that out, and you can go ahead and click it and download it. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Mayra Portolaton is very involved with IFMA. She is the current president of the Capital Chapter. She's also a subject matter expert on sustainability and was involved with the SFP credential, as well as being co-author on some of our how-to guides. Her day job is being a senior professional at FEA. Her co-presenter is Stephen Clausen. He graduated from BYU's FM degree program and is very involved with IFMA as well, serving as the Capital Chapter's Young Professionals Chair. He also has contributed to the FMJ and is presented at World Workplace and Facility Fusion. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to them. Mayra and Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.
Good morning, everybody. Or no, I'm sorry, good afternoon.
Yeah, depending on where you are. Well, we have an exciting presentation today, and we are glad you've joined. We're going to be talking about the facility manager's key to effective emergency preparedness. Some things we want to cover and some things we want you to take home and to your place of work are the elements of an emergency preparedness plan, some of the keys, and as well as some of the benefits of being prepared. We'll first start out with talking about how we define emergency preparedness, how we can envision what an emergency preparedness plan looks like, some instructions, methods for our staff, and then we'll talk about a case study for emergency preparedness. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end.
However, if for some reason you do have some questions, our contact information is provided in the last slide, so you should be able to contact us with any questions later on in the future.
So many questions arise when you talk about emergencies in facilities. Some questions you might think of are, what do I do? Who do I talk to? Where do I go? And what do I do next? And there are many ways to define emergency preparedness. Your organization might define it one way, and your neighbor might define it another way. But everyone has different inputs and might have different outputs and different needs during and after an emergency. So what should an emergency preparedness plan look like? Kind of falls under the purview of a facility manager, and it's necessary to define what an emergency is and how to prepare for it.
And really, depending on your organization, you're going to have different different elements of it. They're all essentially going to have some, a basic background, right? Basic background, and we'll try and definitely share that with you throughout the presentation today, at a higher level kind of thing. We won't get into a lot of the nitty-gritty of stuff, but, when you look at emergency preparedness, anyone that you talk to, everybody will have some basic things that they're always make sure that they're listing as part of their emergency preparedness program. But there's other things that are very unique to each and every one of you. So this is definitely going to be looking at the general side, but start thinking about what other things are, very specific to you that you would want to add into your emergency preparedness plan.
So one definition of emergency preparedness is a state of readiness for a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. So ask yourself, what could create an emergency situation in my facility? It's not always, a weather emergency or a climate-related emergency, but, it could be something as small as or something that happens to your neighbor, all those things could affect your place of work and could define what an emergency is. So,
yeah, example, like, unfortunately, one of the facts of who might not actually be here in the U.S., it's, all the school shootings that have been happening. And sometimes when those are happening, it's not just the school that's going on lockdown, but sometimes the businesses around you are also being locked down because you want to make sure that the people are safe. So emergency preparedness sometimes goes a little bit beyond what you control in your facility, but sometimes something next door might be happening that impacts your ability to come in and out of your facility.
And for instance, one example that something that could occur locally here in the DC area, for those who are in the US, today has been declared a national day of mourning for the passing of former President Bush. So there, could be lots of traffic jams, which could...
Or, like this morning for me, it took me 20 minutes to get into the office instead of 1 hour because most government employees were actually given the day off where they could work from home. So again, you just never know how things would be impacted. Now, if you happen to be in the path of the procession, you're going to find yourself with a lot of traffic or sitting around waiting for the procession to go through, right?
Exactly. So it's not always up to us if the emergency occurs, but it is up to us to prepare for emergencies. So emergency preparedness is very important, as we all know, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. So emergency preparedness fits in right before mitigating your risks and uncovering what kind of things can occur and can disrupt your business and your facilities. And it also is the launchpad for response. So, which is an important part of recovery and discovering what it is we need to mitigate in the future. So today we'll talk about a little bit of each, but focus more on the preparedness. So a big question. Some of your stakeholders might have had these questions, and you might have had to present on these before, but what should be included in your emergency preparedness plan? Those emergency preparedness plans can look different for each facility, for each location, for each site, for each client. But how do your stakeholders define emergency preparedness and what's important to them to have in a plan? So this might look like a long list of detailed and important elements of a plan, but each plan is going to look different as it's catered to your stakeholders.
Yeah, because the important thing is during the actual preparation of your plan is that you're going through all these different line items. Is this something that we need to include in our plan? Is there something that's actually missing from our plan that's not accounted for here? And in some cases, you might not include some of these pieces, or you might expand on them. Some areas would be very, very short. Some would probably be pages and pages covering every angle that you could. But this is just basically your skeleton as to how do you get started. What are the things that you need to start bringing together in order to put together your emergency preparedness plan?
So having said that, even though there's so many different working and moving parts, it doesn't have to be complicated to be sophisticated. Some of the keys, what many of you came to this webinar for today, were to discover what the keys are. And the keys we're going to talk about today fall under leadership, engagement, heightened awareness, business continuity, and a ready workforce. So we'll go ahead and talk about leadership. Dwight D. Eisenhower said, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because he wants to do it.
Yeah, convince them it was their idea, right?
Exactly. Hey, I was thinking the same thing. So there's different elements to leadership. And leadership doesn't always have to come from the top down, but everyone can be a leader. Committing is important. Policies and objectives have to have a start, and it requires commitment. OSHA requires that you have a plan, and we're going to talk about those plans later. And leadership comes from all angles, but the importance of having top leadership is to ensure some accountability and to ensure that documented processes and practices are followed.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes you need to make sure that you have your leadership involved in the planning, that they are, blessing the plan, that they are on board with the plan, because you are going to have sometimes some dissenters who don't like change, who don't like to necessarily have too many rules to follow, too many processes to follow. But if this is coming from your leadership, that, hey, we have a commitment to this, we have a commitment to your safety, we want to make sure that each and every one of you get home each night safely and sound, then these are the processes that we have in place. And it might take you a little bit to kind of get used to it, but after a while, this is going to be, your everyday type of activity. It's not going to seem like something different.
Mm-hmm. So in talking about commitment, all levels of the organization require commitment for an effective emergency preparedness plan. Think to yourselves, does your organization have some type of business resilience policy or business continuity plan? Has it been a topic of discussion before? And if not, then is this something that you can champion? Can you become a leader? Planning is key. I think we all know that. Because the job of operations and maintenance is to keep the business up and running as well as the building, and to support productivity and keep the people safe. That's number one. That's why we have to measure, monitor, plan, and prioritize our systems and equipment maintenance. And think about the reason why we're doing facility management. And those are the reasons why we need to have effective emergency preparedness. So in the event of a disruptive occurrence, what do we do? Some examples of a plan can be a written emergency action plan, which is something that everyone in the U.S. should have, as it's required by OSHA. It should be distributed, accessible, and it should account for all hazards that can affect your facilities.
And it should be something that you're updating on a regular basis, meaning every year you review it, make sure that you've accounted for all the potential hazards that could be. If there has been something that has happened throughout the year that you learned something from, then make adjustments to the plan accordingly, because this is a living, breathing document. You don't want to be pulling out old documentation that, let's say that there was changes to the the physical building, and maybe an exit that used to be there is no longer there because they built an addition to the building, and now that's that door actually leads into another space instead of the outside. So you got to make sure that you're updating these plans on a regular basis.
And here at FEA, we've used the term safety first as the name of a manual for our plan, and that's been integrated into our culture. And so everyone knows when you say safety first, that they're talking about this manual. Okay, so leadership does require decisions, and it desires a leader in a chain of command. So in your organization, who gives you permission, or who do you grant permission to, and what is the structure for accountability, and what direction is the wind going and who's blowing it? An example of an incident command structure is on the screen. And each position within whatever the command structure is in your organization, it should be well defined and should be easy to draw.
And it should be, simple, right? You don't want too many people at the top making decisions. There should be one person at the top making decisions. They may have assistance from a couple of people. Let's talk amongst ourselves, but ultimately it is the incident commander in the case of this particular sample command structure that makes the decision. So it's very clear what the direction that's going to be during an emergency.
Yes, and one of the things to outline in your plan, because you can't always plan who will be available or ready or capable in the event of an emergency, it's important to have the primary person as well as 2 individual backups for each of those roles.
Yeah, you want a backup for the backup too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for backing me up.
All right, so the next key to emergency preparedness is engagement. And we're not really talking about employee engagement here. We're actually talking about others outside of your organization. We'll actually talk about within the organization when we touch upon the ready workforce and key number 5, and we're going to go through some key numbers. But when we're talking about engagements, we want to make sure that we've established some partnerships with some outside organization folks. We're talking about maybe your suppliers, your property managers if you're in a leased facility, your first responders, your restoration contractors. So for example, if you have a flood, or if you're prone to floods and you get a lot of water into your building, you want to have a relationship with a contractor that's going to come out and fix it before you get mold growing in your facility, or if you are out of your facility for long enough that mold does start to develop, you have that relationship with a contractor who is equipped to deal with it, rather than you starting your research right then and there. And now you're going to be in a queue of list of like 20, 30, 40 people that are trying to get in the contractor's appointment list because you're just brand new. They don't have a relationship with you. So make sure that you have established relationship with contractors as well that are going to be providing you some support after the actual incident in itself. But when it comes down to your first responders, you also want to establish a relationship with those local officials. So like your local police station and fire station, the folks that actually come and service your facility should something happen. Talk to them about, how do they want to communicate in the future? Maybe run some exercises with them where you can actually practice, the processes that you have in place, the communication that you have to have with them as soon as they come on site. You want to talk about key control access. Like nowadays, a lot of organizations are going through control access. So you need to have a key fob to go in, or a card swipe, or something to that effect. Or maybe you're still old school and it's a key that you actually have to turn in and lock. So if you're on lockdown, or it's after hours and your building is locked and the police or the fire department has to respond to an emergency in your facility, how are they going to get in? Talk to them about, like, well, do you want to have a key card or a key fob or a key on file that if you know that you're coming in here, someone that's responding to the incident is coming with that access card? Or is it a log box that is right at the entrance of the facility, and they have access to that and they can just press the key or combination, however that is set up. So have those conversations with them, establish a protocol for them to access the facility, and that way you're not finding yourself in trouble that, hey, we can't help you because we can't get into the facility. But also be prepared to answer questions with regards to things that are going to help them go through the emergency in an effective manner that is going to hopefully prevent further injury on your facility, injury on your employees, on them as well, and Lord forbid that there might be some potential loss of life. So you want to make sure that you know where everybody is, that you've accounted for everyone that was inside that facility. So for example, we have a check-in and check-out list that is a one-page dry erase board like in the entrance, and as people are filing out, the person in charge grabs that and takes that outside so that they can go through the list and make sure that, okay, everyone that says that they're in the office are actually standing right outside with me. And if there's somebody that's missing, then we know who it is because we have that list. And so who is in charge? That is the person that is going to be talking to the emergency preparedness folks, the first responder. Information about, hey, there's some processes going on inside that need to be shut down, but we had to leave an emergency, so this needs to be turned off, or where your emergency shutoffs are, your electric, your gas, and your water. If there's a fire alarm that could potentially be triggered, how do they silence that, and why do you want to do that? Unfortunately, on an active shooter event, that is the way that they generate the most harm. They activate a fire alarm, people start coming out, and all of a sudden they've got more victims along the way. So if there's a way for you to silence that fire alarm to avoid people coming out and being exposed to further harm, that is also something that you might want to be able to communicate with your first responders. As well as understanding if there are any employees with any special needs. Maybe somebody couldn't get out because they have special needs, so they have to go first to that area in order to get that person out.
And a great idea too is to include those special needs employees, include them in part of the plan for the incident command structure. So if you can assign people to take care of those who have needs that are noticed or unnoticed, that's a great place for them to be of use, and really should be thought out before the emergency.
Yeah, they can provide very valuable input as to how do we get out in a situation if we need assistance. So the next key in emergency preparedness is heightened awareness. There's a lot of information out there in the internet, social media, and sometimes I think we run the risk of becoming a little bit desensitized on the information that's out there. And so when we become a little bit desensitized, we can maybe get caught unprepared. So we start thinking, it's like, oh, that's just not going to happen here. Or maybe it might happen here, but it's not going to happen to me. Or okay, maybe it does happen to me, but it's never going to be as bad for me. Or, you know what, it can be just as bad. This can happen to me, but there's nothing that I could have done anyway. And really, the numbers say something completely different. And I will show you that in an example in a little bit. But this is really why you want to plan, because there really is ways that maybe it's not preventing it. It is mitigating the amount of damage that can happen, whether it's to personal property, whether it's to physical property, whether it's to life itself. The numbers that you see up, it's pretty daunting. We're talking about 1.4 trillion in damage, 1.7 billion in affected population. 700,000 people die over, between 2005 and 2014, and this is just from disasters alone. But that's not the only threats that are out there. There's definitely a lot of natural occurring and weather-related events, and those are the kinds of things that usually a little bit ahead of time, with some exceptions, of course. An earthquake, unless we've got that crystal ball, we don't know that it's coming, but generally we know when a hurricane is coming, when a storm is coming, and we can somewhat prepare for that. There are certain things that we may not know that it's coming, things like cyber attacks, data breach, but those are things that we can at least start talking about it, and are there things that we can do to mitigate it, to reduce the impact that it has in our operations. And this is our current top 10 threats, and I think that as time goes by, these threats really do change over the years, because cyber attacks were really nothing that maybe 20 years ago we even thought about being an issue, and here it is, the #1 threat right now that is going on. And so you've got FBI's and the police constantly trying to be ahead of the game, and they can't, because it's just ever changing.
And you can imagine that any of these threats would would likely create an emergency situation in your organization. So being prepared for these is a different story for every threat. It is important to recognize that threats are possible even if we don't see them.
Yeah. So the key is really to be prepared, right? So you got to prepare yourself first by doing a risk assessment for the next couple of slides to see what that looks like. Then based on the risks that you have identified, then you can develop what is that incident response going to look like? What are the things that we have to be prepared to handle? What are the supplies, what are the processes that we need to have in place? And then making sure that people understand that so that, that there is some sort of situational awareness, right? So they know how they have to behave during all these different types of situations. So when you look at doing your risk assessment, one of the first things that you have to answer is, what are our essential functions in our organization? What are the things that we absolutely need to be able to still do in order to be able to provide our services to our clients? And sometimes you have to look at it in different processes, not maybe all the way up to the organizational level, but maybe at the department level. So talking to the IT folks, so what are your essential functions? Talking to HR, what are your essential functions? Talking to the people that are delivering the services, what are your essential functions? And then start, narrowing down, so what is essential? What are some this is going to be a little bit of a pain, but I think we can still function for a few days without this. And then how are these things going to disrupt or affect your business? And then start looking at what is the risk of those things happening and prioritizing your threats so that then you can start looking at how do you mitigate those particular risks, and then who is going to be monitoring those risks. So who owns that? So IT should be monitoring IT, right? HR should have nothing to do with the IT. So that's why breaking it down on a department level makes it a little bit easier for you to identify who is going to be owning each particular risk. So you can do something like, this is just a screenshot of our risk assessment tool when we were going through our own, planning. Is going through each function for each department within our organization and figuring out, okay, what is an essential function for you, and what's that potential threat, and are there any internal threats? Are there any external threats? And how severe would be to lose something like, we lost access to our servers with all of our data for providing, for writing our reports for our clients. So we don't have access to that. We can't do our work. So that's a very essential type of function.
And one thing that we did is we went kind of line by line and discovered what our essential functions were, and then we determined what the likelihood of each of those disruptions would be, and also the severity of the impact of that disruption, and that's how we helped prioritize what threats and risks were the most or could be the most damaging to our company.
Exactly. And when going through risk assessments, also you have to think about what's unique to your particular location. So for example, we have offices in California, we have an office in Colorado, and we have an office here in Virginia. And what might be a potential threat, especially when you think about natural disasters, are different for each of us. Mm-hmm. So we have to make sure that we're also taking into account our location when we're doing our risk assessments, and making sure that our plans covers all the different parts of where our organization actually sits physically. But really curious about you guys on the line right now. And Joshua's going to pull up a poll right now. If you can pull that up, and would love to hear from you guys.
Give it just a moment.
Okay.
Okay. And it's 77% said yes and 23% said no.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, next follow-up question, if you've answered yes, was there a plan in place prior to the incident that helped with your response?
And that was 88% said yes, 13% said no.
Well, that's very impressive. I like the sound of that. That's great that there were plans in place, and for those of you for where there were no plans in place, hopefully this will provide you with a start of thinking about how do you plan for responding to an incident.
And those of you who did experience one, you know the importance of having some type of plan.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure you have some critique and some vision of where you want it to go, and how you want your plan to evolve over time.
Exactly. So going back to our slides, there we go. So, once you then have your risk assessment, that's when you start looking into putting together your incident response. This is going to include how you're communicating, not just to your internal staff, but outside, like your clients. What types of supplies do you need to have in place? And where are you actually going to put those supplies? It should not be locked down in some place where only one person has the key and that person is not in the office,
or in the basement,
50% of the time. It has to be someplace that is accessible, that it makes sense for the type of emergency. And then looking at what the different procedures are going to be to minimize your risk of injury or even worse, potentially loss of life. So you want to have a written guide with your procedures, like what Stephen said earlier. Our safety first plan is basically our emergency action plan, and has all these different procedures for all the potential incidences that we feel would occur here in our facility. And there was one that we added because we actually ended up having an earthquake, really small, nothing like California style. We're talking really very minimal. But we understood that, okay, that's something that we would have never put in our plan because that's not something that happens here all the time. But it happened, and now we've learned from it. People didn't know what to do. And so, some people did totally the wrong thing because, there's so much common sense that you can have, especially if you've never lived in an area where there's earthquakes. So then we added the earthquake, scenario into our plan. We've talked about, evacuation, what you need to do, where your shelter in place is going to be, and are there multiple shelter in places? It's really going to depend on how big your organization is. If you're pretty big, you're probably going to have multiple places for shelter in place. Also want to make sure that the plan includes an alternate facility. Let's say that you can't come back to your facility. Where are you going to resume your work while you figure out how to get back into your facility? Do you have an alternate facility in place? And later on, Stephen will talk in our case study about what happened with our alternate facility. And then also what the return to normal procedures are going to be, and who will that message will be coming from.
Mm-hmm. One of the great things too about having this plan is, regardless of the emergency, some of the things will be consistent, like your incident command structure, your communication plan, and the things that will be unchanging. Even differing emergency situations.
Mm-hmm. All these people, where do I go to next? What's my next one? Aware of what's going on, and please don't text and walk or run or whatever it is that you're doing that says please don't text and walk, because you see people, falling into holes or running into people because they're too busy texting and doing that kind of stuff. During an emergency situation, your phone should not be, texting or looking into your phone.
Right.
The only reason what you would want you have your phone is like you're calling 911 to let them know that there's an emergency.
The jokester in me wants to put up a sign next to it that says "Don't run with scissors."
But you also want to make sure that people are being safe, that they understand the things that they should be doing, not be doing. I think there's so much that we can do on the actual education of folks, and I think inherently people know that they have that survival instinct and they will go and just go. And I always say it's like, okay, it's okay, you're getting out there, but if you see someone fall down, please help them. Don't go through. It's like we want to make sure we all kind of like get out there. So yes, it is about personal safety, but let's make sure that we're also looking out for each other.
Yeah, and people do come first, so
Mm-hmm.
They should be the focus.
Yeah, they should not be trying to save like equipment or hauling computers out or anything like that. They should be taking themselves out of the facility, especially in the case of fire or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. The equipment can be replaced. There's insurance in place to take care of a lot of these different things. People are, they're not replaceable.
So encouraging situational awareness and really just common sense can be part of your emergency preparedness plan.
Mm-hmm. Now, the next key is really business continuity. So emergency planning is not just about dealing with that incident right then and there. It's also about, what happens next? You've got everyone out in the parking lot. What are you going to do now? What's going to happen over the next 48 hours, next 72 hours, next week? What if you can't get back into your building for a month? What do you have a plan in place to how do you continue with your business during that time frame? That's where your business continuity plan comes into play. It's really your next step in the planning evolution. You want to, again, make sure that there's a change of command who is making the decisions, that they're communicating what needs to happen next over that period of time that you might not be in, where you usually are physically. The change of command does not necessarily have to be like the CEO of the company, right? If it's something like in our case where we have offices in 3 different states, if it's something that's very specific to just one of our offices, there's no reason why the CEO who might be sitting in one of the other states needs to be making all the different decisions. We have a local incident commander who is basically doing all the commands, making all the decisions. They may actually still consult with the CEO or other people in the chain of command, but they're the ones where the communication is coming from. They're the ones that are making the decisions. Again, prioritizing what needs to be fixed first. Maybe it's not getting back into the building, but making sure that the first things that we have access to is how do we continue doing our business? Does everybody have a laptop? Does everybody have access to our servers that, maybe in another location? Is there anything that that we need to make sure we do first so that we can go about our business. And establishing that alternate site. Are people going to be working from home until further notice, or are we actually going to have people come to a different location and work from there instead? And it really does depend on your operation. And it could be that maybe you do a combination of this, where some people work from home and some people do show up to an alternate site. But all in all, there has to be a communication in place as to how all this gets, related to all the employees, to anyone who may have anything to do with how the business is being disrupted. Like, are there announcements going on in your company website or in LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, whatever it is that is your main way of communicating with your clients, making sure that, you're not just communicating with but also with your clients, that they know what their status is in their service. And then the last key part here is what I mentioned earlier, your ready workforce, right? You need to make sure that they know what to do, because again, there's so much that common sense is going to do for you. And this is a really good example right here. So there was, this is really showing the importance of training. We had, so there was 2 airplanes. It was the same type of airplane. There was a fire on the runway in each case. One happened in Canada and one happened in Greece. Now, unfortunately, Greece had 55 fatalities, where Canada did not see any. And again, same thing, fire in the runway, same airplane, just different locations. So what was the difference then? What set these 2 incidences apart? So investigators actually found that in the case of Greece, 100% were first-time flyers. So really, the only safety training that they had received ever happened right at that flight, beginning of that flight, where they show you that little video that we've all sort of seen, right? And when you're first-time flyers, you might not even know that you should be paying attention to that, or you don't care to know, to even pay attention to that. But even as frequent flyers, not everybody is always like looking at that. But when you fly enough, that is going in the background, and some of it kind of sticks, right? Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you're learning because it's getting absorbed, and you see, certain occasions. So you had, no fatalities in one where you had 75% were frequent flyers. And that's really a testament to that, training does really make a difference. It's really looking at, in the case of something like this, of, flying, that muscle memory is so important, because again, like I said, you hear it all the time in the background when you're going on a plane. You might not be paying attention, but it's sort of kind of getting absorbed, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is what we need to make sure that we're doing for our emergency planning, that we're educating our employees on what the procedures are, what are the plans in place, what are the policies. And you do that by, doing exercises and drills where you're practicing them over and over again. So you're developing that muscle memory. And then because you're doing it so often, it just kind of becomes part of the culture. So, people don't really think about it. Yes, you might get some grumps in the beginning because, oh my God, we're doing another drill. Oh my God, we're doing another one of these exercises. But after a while, they will understand the value of actually doing this, because it's going to, really commit to mind what it is that they need to do in the case of an emergency.
Mm-hmm. And what's the point in having an emergency preparedness plan if nobody's ever practiced it or used it? So training is really essential, and everybody has their own part to play.
Yeah. So some of the things that you can do are drills, and I think you can really start small here, right? We've all done fire drills. If you're in California, you've probably done some earthquake drills. So those are little things that you can start with to kind of get people into practice. But then you can start going a little bit further and throwing in some of those scenarios that maybe not be the things that you do often, or that might be a risk often, but you should still kind of prepare yourself. So do tabletop exercises where you really kind of talk through a particular incident. Like we just did one back in September where it was actually a cyber attack incident, tabletop. So we all went through it, and how would we handle that, and how would we respond to it, and who's responsible. And it was a really good exercise to really understand what our own policies that are in place to making sure that we have backup for everything and that we're not really losing a lot of data.
And some of the differences between drills and exercises, drills sometimes don't require much discussion. They just kind of happen. Whereas exercises, there's room for discussion. There's room to ask, how is our plan, how does our plan work for us? Do we see any gaps? Is there anything we need to train more on, more things we need to flush out or practice? And the more detailed you get in your exercise, there are different terms used like tabletop, functional, and full scale. You can decide what's important for your organization, but for all organizations, it's important to exercise.
Yeah, and those three that we've got right here are just three, resources for you to do just that, to do some exercises and drills. And one of the other things that's really helpful as part of the exercise and drill situation is having some written resources, like a readiness handbook, where it's really short and sweet kind of guide for people to just know some of the basics of what to do when handling an emergency. And so every one of especially the tabletop exercises, have had a readiness handbook associated with it, because it does contain the talking points and some exercises, the questions that we want to make sure that we ask, and then some, it also has places for like lessons learned. What would you have changed? What are some things that we may have not thought about that you thought about during the exercise that we should be incorporating into the plan? So it's a really great way for you to do continual improvement in your plan, which, like I said earlier during the presentation, it's like it is very important that these are living, breathing documents that are constantly being reviewed and changed. Mm-hmm. You cannot, count on this being effective year after year. Absolutely not. And actually, Stephen's going to talk to you now about, how this actually helped us in the first one. Actually, it turned out that we had to handle an actual incident in one of our offices.
Yep. And as a precursor to that, we have in our readiness resources, like a handbook, we have started to designate as part of our risk assessment. We've gone through some of those essential functions, and we've prioritized those with the blessing of our top leadership. And we've included those in our readiness resources. So when some type of disruptive event occurs, the next one, when it occurs in our facilities, our managers and top leadership, they understand what they need to get going first, what's most important, what functions do we need to focus on, and to rush our resources to. So as Myra said, we have one of our facilities is in California, and it's in Santa Rosa, California, which is, you may have heard in the news within the past year.
Last October.
It was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And some people have nicknamed it kind of the Santa Rosa fires, and I've heard some other names, but I think the official is the Tubbs fire. At the time, it was the most destructive in California history, which says a lot. And it first started on October 8th, and it wasn't contained until October 31st. So it burned for a long time, and it burned a lot of area. Fortunately, there were very few deaths, given the
magnitude, yeah.
Yeah, the magnitude of what this really was. And it was very destructive. and it will take a long time for Santa Rosa to make a full recovery. Our facility is located in a specific area. On the slide, you can see it in the circle there on the right. And we occupy an office in that building, which is there kind of on a slope. But the evacuation alerts occurred in the middle of the night. So none of our employees were in the office. They were all in their homes. And it came as a surprise, as emergencies always do. And everyone had to evacuate. So you'll see the picture on the top left. If you're able to zoom in or see, you can see it says Hilton. That's the Hilton, or was the Hilton Hotel. That was actually that was a backup facility for our, as part of our plan. It was a second backup, though. Our first backup was to work from home, and we had gone through some extensive planning, about a year before this, to define what resources we would need and to prioritize our functions. And we had decided to create a policy that we would take our laptops home, and for our business, that seemed to work well, and would be eligible to be our first line of defense for a facility to work in would be to work from home. However, people were evacuated from their homes in many parts of the city, and so we had to get creative using our plan in deciphering where we should go. And you'll see that if you can see, our office is on Round Barn Boulevard, and it's named after a historic round barn there in Santa Rosa. If any of you have been there, that barn actually burned down, and fortunately our facility is still standing, though there were some effects from
the barn is across
smoke.
the street.
Yeah,
right,
literally across the street.
So we actually logged out that fire kind of almost stopped, like right across the street, and then like jumped to our facility.
However, there were still impacts to our workforce and to our operations. But some of the things that we learned in having done some thorough planning before the incident, we were able to account for our employees within 30 minutes, which is, for a smaller office and smaller operations, is really impressive. We were still able to work, even though it was remotely, and there was some downtime with some productivity and things like that because of inconvenience and, of course, the emotional stress. But ultimately, our business was fine. And had we not done that planning, we might be in a different situation, and it might have contributed to more stress or even further inconveniences. So we were able to identify some gaps, though, through this, and we made
kind of look back at our communications plan. It was a little bit more clear as to who should be communicating, how often, and what kind of communication should be going out.
So in the case for emergency preparedness, it's important to plan because planning is important. So there are specific risks for not planning, but also even greater benefits of planning.
Yeah, I think what you have to understand is that when you don't plan, there's so much more than just the loss even of assets, and there's sometimes even reputation at stake because you did not plan. So don't just think about the tangible stuff. There might be some intangible stuff that really do come into play, and when you have these plans in place, and you almost don't skip a beat in your ability to provide services to your client or products to your client, that's really going to leave a good impression on them and seeing you as a reliable organization, someone who's planning, who has their clients' interest in heart. And your employees obviously are going to appreciate it because you are making sure that they too, continue to be employed as well as be safe and continue to be able to come home day in and day out.
So operations and maintenance play into emergency preparedness. And we know the role of the FM is to enable the customer to continue its mission. And the same is said through any disruptive incident or emergency, that it's all about continuing the mission and taking it a step further than just accounting for your people, because people are important, but what do those people do after they're all accounted for? So through proper planning, you can minimize the impacts of a disruption, you can improve overall performance, and you can minimize corporate risk. You might be thinking, okay, this is a lot of information. Where am I at and where do I start? So we have a resource for you on our website that will give you a good starting point. And if you answer a few questions that are yes or no, it will tell you at what level you are ready for some kind of disruptive event.
So for those 12% of you that said that you did not have a plan in place, maybe this is a place for you to start and figure out what you already have and don't have and see if that kind of gives you an idea of where do you need to go from there.
Beyond that, there are some other resources out there. They're very extensive. Some of the ones that I would like to point to are ready.gov/business. It will help you get in the mindset and recognize some of maybe the gaps of what your facilities and what your organization requires. And you can even start with some training through the NIMS 100 course, or just start having those crucial conversations with key stakeholders and deciding what's important and what needs to continue through an emergency.
All right, so we are actually almost, I think, at the top of the hour, so we might not have time for any questions. But like I said, we have our contact information here, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. Unless, Joshua, you have any questions that you might want to.
Just one in, hopefully it might not take long to answer. It says, how do larger organizations account for people during an evacuation?
So for us, obviously, it's simple because we're very small. But when it comes down to larger organizations, what you're going to have is different emergency wardens that are responsible for smaller portions of your organization's population. So it might be a floor warden, or it might be a floor/department warden. So it makes it a little bit more manageable, and they know who's in and who's out. I happen to do contract work for one of our clients where they actually have included me in their emergency plan, even though I'm not there 100%. So I might be there once a week, but whenever they have an emergency situation, they send out a text to everybody, and you are supposed to reply with yes or no as far as like whether or not you've received it or not, so that they have some sort of acknowledgement that you've responded to them. Or it could be that the question that they send out is like, are you out and safe? So there's different applications and different things that you can actually use in order to gather that information relatively quickly, and not just have something as simple as what we had, which was just a little dry erase board with a list of names.
And something important too is that you don't always have to mimic the same managerial outlay of your company. You can also have an emergency warden who oversees people who doesn't necessarily manage them. Mm-hmm. It's okay if they're not the same, as long as those are communicated and trained and documented.
Yeah, people need to know who they're supposed to be reporting to let them know, hey, I'm safe, I'm here,
right,
I made it out.
So good question.
Great, and at that, we are at time. I want to thank Mayra and Stephen for a great and interesting presentation, and I want to thank everyone for attending. Again, before I sign off, if you want a copy of the PDF of the PowerPoint, you can go ahead and download that now under the handout section before I close out the show, and it will be on the CFC website, which is ifmacfc.org. You can check out the recording of this presentation there as well. Everyone, thank you very much and have a great rest of the year. Bye-bye.